You may have heard that SQL Database in Fabric is secured and governed by default. What does that mean? Learn all about it this week on Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed. Today, I'm joined by Jakub, who leads the product management for security for SQL Database in Fabric. Jakub, thanks so much for coming on Data Exposed.
Hi, Anna. Hey, everybody. Great to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. You're no stranger to Data Exposed, although I think it's been a while since you've been on last. Today, and I think like a big focus that you've been working on and the team has been working on is SQL databases in Fabric, which is in public preview. And one big selling point of Fabric generally and SQL database that we're going for is kind of this ease of use, kind of low code, no code. You don't have to be this huge SQL expert to kind of onboard. And security, on the other hand, is something that's generally perceived as kind of hard. So what does that mean for Fabric? Like, what's your take?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, in Fabric, the key value prop is ease of use. And for example, when you provision a database, you're supposed to pick a name and click create, and that's it. All things are set up for you automatically. And that extends very much to security. When you create a database, multiple access controls are just pre-configured, pre-enabled for you. You don't have to worry about them. And some of these controls are completely zero touch or hands-on. And a great example in that category is data encryption. So we put your data in an encrypted storage using Microsoft managed keys. TLS, Transport Layer Security 1.2, gets enabled in all database connections. You have to do absolutely nothing to ensure that your data is encrypted at rest and in transit. This is done for you automatically.
Awesome. That's great. I mean, I love to not have to think about this. Again, like you said, it just makes it easier for folks, and to know that Microsoft is managing the keys, that helps too.
Yep.
I think going right along with that is another thing that's typically challenging to set up, and that's authentication and access control or authorization. Can you tell us a little bit about how maybe we're making it easier there?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Microsoft Entra Authentication is the authentication solution for all Microsoft Fabric. That includes SQL Database. And it brings very important benefits: central identity management, multi-factor authentication, passwordless authentication for applications. And in SQL Database and Fabric, we really made it super easy for customers to start with MS Entra Authentication. And that is achieved by seamless integration of SQL Database with Fabric roles and workspace roles and permissions. The easiest way to actually explain it is through a demo. So let me show you a quick demo here of that. In Fabric, we have these different roles: workspace admin, contributor, viewer, and so on. And we have different item permissions. Now, if I want to enable a user to authenticate to a SQL database and to access it, all I need to do is to add the user to one of these roles or grant the user a permission. And after that, they can connect and either using Query Editor in the portal, or an application, or SQL Server Management Studio, as you can see here, and they can access whatever the role or the permission allows them to access in the database. Now, to really appreciate it, you need to try and experience that in other SQL offerings and products, like Azure SQL Database, for example, where to achieve a similar scenario, you have to do several other steps, which are either completely obsolete, eliminated in Microsoft Fabric, or we've made them optional. So it's super easy to get started with MS Entra Authentication and, in general, basic access control. Right now, these workspace roles and Fabric permissions, they are great. They are easy to use. They make it really easy, as we show, to start with MS Entra Out. But they only really support two distinct scenarios, right? So you can make somebody a DBA in a database in Fabric, or you can grant them read-only access. And sooner or later, most customers will end up will need to do to implement more granular or more fine-grain access control. And typically, traditionally, that is achieved by using SQL native access control mechanisms like numerous permissions that we have and database level roles. And traditionally, they are configured using T-SQL. And T-SQL and these complex security mechanisms can be a little intimidating for customers who have no experience with them. So for customers who prefer low-code, no-code development, we created this experience in Microsoft Fabric portal that hides these complexities. So let me show you that quickly. So the experience is called Manage SQL Security. You open it and you see the list of built-in roles in your database. But what's more interesting is that you can create a custom role. And in this case, in this custom role, I'm granting its future members permission to run select queries on views and tables in one very specific schema. So it's a much narrower scope than viewing everything in the database. Once I click Save, the portal automatically creates a database, runs T-SQL statement to create a role in the database, and we can start adding users to the role. So I'm adding user 2 here, and I click Add, and now in SQL Database and Fabric, you can grant user all SQL native permissions that you want, but the user won't be able to connect to the database until the database has been shared with the user. So if it hasn't, that experience prompts us to do that. So let's do that. Let's share the database with the user. And now once we click Save, all the magic happens under the covers. The user is added to the role, and the user can start connecting to the database. And you saw here that if the user queries a table in a sales LT schema, that succeeds, that works. But if they try to access anything else beyond what the role allows them to access, they get an error. They cannot do that, right? So this is a very easy way to more closely adhere to security best practice, such as the principle of least privilege, without writing any T-SQL code, just by using this fairly intuitive UI.
Awesome. Makes a ton of sense. I think just to reflect on a couple things I heard that were interesting. One is I love that we're making it easy for people who aren't experts to get started. But I think everyone will feel good knowing that, hey, if you want to go in there and you want to write T-SQL, that still works, right?
Absolutely, that still works, right? So we have 3 levels. We have the super easy and intuitive Fabric access controls, workspace roles and permissions. Then we have this intuitive UI for customers who want more fine-grained access control without using T-SQL. And of course, T-SQL is still there. We're not taking it away. So if somebody is an expert in that, they can definitely use that.
Awesome. And then one more question. It's a hard question and controversial question. I didn't tell you that I was going to ask it, but here we are. You said Microsoft Intra for all connections. I just want to be really clear. That means no SQL auth. And from your perspective, can you comment a little bit on why we made this choice, or what kind of you think about this choice that we made?
Right. Yes, that is absolutely correct. SQL authentication is not supported in SQL databases in Fabric, but that is true about Fabric all up. MS Entra authentication is the standard and the only supported authentication mechanism across all Fabric workloads. So we wanted to align with that and be consistent with that. And also, frankly, MS Entra authentication is in many aspects superior to this native SQL authentication mechanism that some customers still use. It offers, as I mentioned, multi-factor authentication, secretless, passwordless authentication. It adheres basically to modern expectations and modern standards around security and compliance. So we believe this is going to benefit benefit many customers. And we see that even in other platforms where MS authentication is optional, many customers are taking advantage of it.
Awesome. No, I love it. And I think it goes back to like, we're promising you ease of use, but we're also promising you secure by default. And so we're giving you the most secure way to authenticate.
Precisely,
Yeah.
yes.
Awesome. Okay, I know there are other topics. We hear a lot of people talking about Purview. Like, how does Purview work with Fabric SQL Database?
Yeah, so first it's important to call out that, Microsoft Purview is not new in general. It has been used for years by many Office 365 customers to secure sensitive information in Office documents, emails, and so on, right? Now, Microsoft Fabric is bringing these important benefits to the world of data, which includes SQL Database in Fabric. So now you can label SQL database items and any other items in your Fabric workspace with Purview labels defined in your organization. And compliance administrators in your org can define protection policies to centrally manage and restrict access to certain data items in Fabric depending on their sensitivity labels. So again, the best way to explain that in more detail is by showing you a demo. So what you're looking at here is a Purview portal. I'm logged on to Purview portal, and I'm showing you an example of protection policy definition. Now, each protection policy in Purview is tied to a specific sensitivity label. In this case, it is tied to the label that is called protected. You can name these labels in any way you like confidential, very confidential, and so on. In my environment, I have a label that is named protected. And now, another key part of the protection policy, Purview protection policy configuration is shown on this screen. There are basically two key sections here. Allow users to retain read access and allow users to retain full control access. Now, what the meaning of this section is the following. If a user has been granted permission in Fabric to read or have full control access to a certain item in Fabric, like a SQL database, they will be allowed to retain that access if they are explicitly listed in this policy, not necessarily directly. I could list groups the users belong to here, but they must be listed in the policy to retain that access granted through Fabric to items that are labeled with the label reference in that policy, right? So now, back to my Fabric workspace, I'm looking at the database 01 database. It has a bunch of users, and user 3 is in the workspace viewer role, but you might recall from the previous screen that user 3 has not been listed explicitly in the protection policy for the label that is attached to the database, right? So now what's interesting is that user 3, who again, although they are granted, they are in the viewer role for the database, they are denied access through the MIP Purview protection policy. If that user logs on to Fabric portal, look at this. They cannot even see the database 01. It just it didn't exist. They cannot access it. Of course, they cannot open a query editor and query it because the database doesn't even show up, right? So you may ask, okay, so what happens if I open SQL Server Management Studio or an application and try to connect to the database? Again, that access is denied. I cannot connect. So you can see here that these MIP protection, Purview, Microsoft Information Protection policies, they override permissions granted in Fabric, and they allow compliance admins to manage who can access sensitive information based on their sensitivity labels centrally in one place in Microsoft Purview portal.
Awesome. That's great to see. And it really illustrates the point that, like, hey, if they set this in Purview, like, it's set, and no one downstream is going to kind of mess with that
Exactly.
setting. The last question, or maybe the last question that I have, is around private link, which we announced some support for at the tenant level recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about how it works in SQL Database and Fabric?
Yeah, so basically, the goal of private link is to secure inbound traffic for all the resources in a given Fabric tenant. Right now, this is a tenant level feature, so you can use it to isolate any traffic that targets your Fabric resources for Fabric items from the internet. Make sure it is transported over a private channel. That's what this private link represents, and this traffic can originate in a virtual network, either in Azure, for example. So you can have a virtual machine that calls your Fabric resources, and that is in a VNet, and the traffic will be sent over that private link. Or you can access these resources through the private link, an express route from on-premises. Now, unlike these other features, many of that we discussed earlier, many of which are just enabled and ready to use, or almost ready to use for you in Fabric. This is not one of them, right? So it's not something we can just enable by default for all customers for multiple reasons. One is private link has cost and performance implications, and it also configuring it requires user input about their network configuration and so on. So that's something that customer needs to actively opt into and configure, but we are trying to make it as easy as possible, and there are more developments to come on that front in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. And while it's not, quite as turnkey as some of the other capabilities, what is nice is you set it up for all of Fabric, and then you can ensure that people are connecting from your tenant in a secure fashion. Jakub, I learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers have as well. One last question for you, since you are leading SQL and security in this space, can you share a little bit, what's on the roadmap for SQL Database and Fabric and the security front?
Right. So I'd like to mention two things that we are actively working on and we are really excited about, two things that have been requested by many customers. One is auditing, so ability to generate SQL audit records, and that's one thing we are working on. And the other is an encryption addressed using customer managed keys. As we discussed earlier in this presentation, in this discussion, today we support encryption addressed using Microsoft managed keys. And we are working on enabling encryption with customer managed keys, not just for SQL database, but other Fabric workloads as well. So we are really looking forward and excited about these two capabilities.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, no, those are great and very much enterprise requirements, and we're looking forward to seeing them. Hey, viewers, if you like this episode, go ahead, give it a like, leave us a comment, and let us know which feature you're most excited about. We'll put some links in the description for you to go learn more, and we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.